which has a semi-contemporary setting, and it's about storytelling to some degree as well. And I thought it'd be fun to play off, first of all, to be able to write a contemporary story with a Tolkien influence, and secondly, to play off the storytelling aspects of that. So that's where I got in this whole idea of a tree of tales, and the fact that myths and stories are what define us as a people, or as a society, or as a culture.
Terry, was it difficult to write a story honoring Tolkien without being able to use any of his characters?
There was, what I liked was some reviewers actually said that the Trollbridge story was the one that was most in the vein of Tolkien, which had some kind of underlying Tolkien-ness about it. Because there was that sense of loss about, the war has been won, but in fact you've actually lost that which you were fighting for, which is the case with every war. And in effect, in Trollbridge, I'll explain for those that haven't seen the anthology, an old troll and an old hero meet up long after the war, which has clearly been the War of the Ring. And they realise that they've both grown old, and all the values they had have been forgotten. And the hobbits have built farms across the whole of the wilderness, and their world does not exist anymore. And there's some powerful imagery there, and it was fun to do.
Well, how much influence would you say Tolkien's had on the work that you're best known for, your Discworld books?
Tolkien's had a lot of influence on me for a very specific reason. Now, I have to recap a bit on this. I don't think Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was the funniest science fiction novel ever written. The funniest science fiction novel ever written was Bill the Galactic Hero, which I think came out in the very early 60s. It was written by Harry Harrison. But it didn't become a bestseller because there weren't that many people in those days that realized what was being parodied. Now, when Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came out in 1976, the imagery of science fiction had been welded into our society. Everyone had seen Star Trek, and most people had seen Star Wars, and 2001, and lots of people had read Asimov by then. And there were enough people around that were noddingly familiar with science fiction to get some of the parodies and gags in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, when I started doing the Discworld series in 1985, it was just time then. Tolkien had come and gone, his imitators had come along. There were enough people there familiar with basic heroic fantasy for me to write books that would sell to millions of people. Had I written The Colour of Magic in 1960, about 5,000 people would have read it and enjoyed it. But to some extent, I mean, I have to say this, when in doubt, a good old parody of Tolkien always works.
Now, to my mind, Terry's Discworld books are the funniest fantasy ever written. And unlike, say, the well-known Harvard Lampoon spoof, Board of the Rings, Terry's tales stand on their own. Another author influenced by Tolkien is Guy Gavriel Kay, who's best known for his bestsellers, The Fiona of Our Tapestry and A Song for Arbonne. Nancy, open a line to Toronto, please. Actually, Guy Kay assisted Tolkien's son Christopher in completing the Silmarillion, the book Tolkien was writing when he passed away in 1973. Hi, Guy, it's Rick. Where does the Silmarillion fit into the body of Tolkien's work?
My own sense of it is that in many respects it's his most brilliant achievement, but not in any way his finest book, which sounds paradoxical, but the sense I have is that what he did with the Silmarillion was what whole cultures do with their body of myth and legend. What he did with The Lord of the Rings and with The Hobbit was write wonderful novels. The Silmarillion is not a wonderful novel, it's an extraordinary imaginative achievement. And I think that's the distinction between the two.
A lot of critics say that because his books have sold hundreds of thousands of copies, Tolkien essentially invented the modern fantasy genre. Do you think if he'd never written the Rings trilogy, there simply wouldn't be a market for books like your Fiona of Our Tapestry?
Oh, unquestionably, unquestionably. Whatever one may say about Tolkien's impact on the aesthetics of the genre, and there's some room for debate on that. I would pitch him right at the top, but some people might argue slightly differently. There's absolutely no argument that in practical economic terms, in the creation of a market, Tolkien literally, single-handedly did that. The existence of a fantasy market is a function of The Lord of the Rings.
How do you think that the year you spent working on the Silmarillion affected your own fiction?
Having seen the drafts and the notes, the letters, the scribbled messages to himself, the false starts, I was to a certain degree inoculated against that kind of creatively destructive awe that would have led me to say, as I think many young fantasy writers did say, I can't work in this vein. Or, what many other writers did, I'm going to work in this vein and try to do the same thing. I think that fantasy post-Tolkien has tended to be split into those writers who are doing derivative reproductions of Tolkien's work, and those much more creative writers who are saying there's a much wider ranged fantasy than what Tolkien did, and I'm going to go into another part of the forest. Somehow my involvement in the Silmarillion allowed me to say, I think I can work in this part of the forest and find a space for myself, that I can mine some of the same material without fearing that I'll be lost in the large shadow that Tolkien cast.
Well, there's no danger of that. Thanks, Guy. J.R.R. Tolkien carefully constructed his Middle-earth out of the history and legends of a number of different cultures, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, even a touch of Finland in the Silmarillion. Some authors have tried to avoid overlapping Tolkien by picking one particular mythology to be the sole foundation for their stories. For example, Diana Paxson's novel The White Raven retells the Celtic legend of Tristan and Isolde, while The Wolf and the Raven is a 5th century Germanic tale that lost its copyright in the 6th century.
I was going to say, what do you think Tolkien did for fantasy? He certainly brought a lot of readers to it, but do you think that
Well, he made it respectable again. I mean, originally, literature was fantasy up until the emergence of the concept of mainstream fiction. And Tolkien was completely unreconstructed romantic who had no use for the 20th century and could care less what they thought was great literature. So he went his own way and did his own thing, and he did it very, very well. And so suddenly he put this on the map, and money talks. And the publishers went, oh, gee, this stuff sells. Maybe we can do more of it. And, of course, at first, more of it often was extremely derivative, but gradually the idea began to percolate around that you could do things that were fantasy that were not Tolkien imitations. In fact, at first there was even a kind of a negative influence because with certain kinds of plot lines, there will be plot challenges, and you've got your characters into this situation, you've got to get them out. With certain kinds of situations, Tolkien had already taken the best solution. So you had your choice of either finding a second best way of dealing with whatever it was, or just throwing out that plot element and doing something totally different. So a lot of my very early plotting was spent trying to avoid repeating and imitating Tolkien.